Welcome back to the second chance of the Earl of Blackwood. In part one, Elara tended to the amnesiac Rhys, discovered the cruelty of his past self, and ultimately surrendered to the dangerous courtship of the kind man he became. She is now hopelessly in love with a ghost. Now, in part two, the story barrels toward its climax. Rhys is confronted by his old friends, forcing him to choose between the comfortable, cold identity of the Earl and the vulnerable, protective man he is now. This confrontation will shatter Alara's carefully constructed emotional walls, leading them both to the final, fatal choice. Let's find out if the man Elara loves can truly defeat the monster he used to be. Part 5. The confrontation with the past. The bubble we had created, a fragile sanctuary built on amnesia and reluctant hope, was destined to burst. Rhys was recovering rapidly, his physical strength returning, and with it the necessity of re-engaging with the world of the Earl of Blackwood. I had dreaded the arrival of his past acquaintances, those cold, shallow members of his social circle who only saw him as a title and a source of sport. They came one crisp autumn afternoon, arriving in a flurry of ostentatious carriages and loud, familiar laughter that felt sacrilegious in the quiet manor. Rhys was downstairs, attempting to go through a ledger in the study, his face still etched with confusion whenever he saw his old, ruthless handwriting. I was forced to join him when the guests were announced. Three gentlemen, Lord Harrington, Sir Malcolm, and Mr. Davies, strode into the room, all loud voices and booming backslaps. They were the very embodiment of the cold, arrogant world Rhys used to inhabit, and I watched, my heart hammering, as Rhys tried to fit into the sharp, defined shape of the man they knew. "Rhys, the man himself," Harrington bellowed, slapping Rhys on the shoulder. Rhys flinched, not from pain, but from the unwelcome, aggressive familiarity. They launched into a stream of bawdy stories and callous reminiscences. "Remember that debacle at Ascot? You told the Duchess her hat looked like a drowned swan." Sir Malcolm roared, clutching his sides. Rhys offered a strained smile, a performance of the easy arrogance he had once mastered, but it failed miserably. He looked utterly disconnected, like an actor struggling with lines written for a character he despised. He was trying to be the cruel, rakish Earl they remembered, and failing because the man inside was now gentle and kind. Then, inevitably, their attention swung to me. I stood quietly in the corner, a necessary backdrop to the main spectacle, as I always had. Mr. Davies, a man whose eyes were always a shade too knowing, paused in his tale and looked me up and down with a lazy, leering amusement. "Ah, the quiet wife," he drawled, taking a sip of his brandy. He turned back to Rhys, elbowing him playfully. "Still stuck with the quiet wife, eh, Rhys? I remember you used to say Elara was the perfect decoration, beautifully silent." The silence in the room became instant, thick and chilling. I felt the familiar, crushing shame, the decades of my husband's cold disdain summarized in one ugly sentence. I braced myself for the silence, for the dismissal, for the confirmation of my worthlessness that Rhys had always offered. But it didn't come. Rhys's head snapped up. The light, confused look that had defined the amnesiac vanished. In its place settled a profound, dangerous coldness, the familiar, formidable authority of the Earl. But this time it was aimed at his friends, not at me. His face went utterly still, carved from granite. His eyes, the sharp, flint-gray eyes I recognized from 4 years of marriage, narrowed to dangerous slits. He set the ledger down on the desk with a low, deliberate thud. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden, quiet intensity of his tone commanded immediate attention. "You will speak of my wife with respect, Mr. Davies," Rhys said, his voice low and deadly, a silken threat. Every syllable was perfectly weighted, radiating the unquestionable power of his title. "You will apologize for your tasteless observation, or you will take your leave of Blackwood Manor now and never return." Davies visibly paled, stammering an immediate apology. Lord Harrington and Sir Malcolm shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the authentic fury of the Earl, a fury they had never witnessed directed at them. In that moment, Rhys was every inch the Earl of Blackwood, authoritative, ruthless, and commanding. But he was wielding that terrifying power not to crush me, but to defend me. The internal battle I had waged for weeks simply ceased. The line between the kind ghost and the cruel Earl blurred, and then dissolved. I saw the best of both versions of him. The inherent authority and strength of the old married perfectly to the protectiveness and genuine respect of the new. It shattered my resolve. I realized that the amnesia hadn't made him a new man. It had simply stripped away the layers of bitterness and societal expectation that had choked the good man within. The core strength, the will to defend what he considered his, was still there, but now I was the thing he was protecting. The guests, chastened, quickly offered their goodbyes. Rhys watched them go, his powerful stance unwavering until the door clicked shut behind them. He turned to me then, and the cold mask dropped away, replaced by a look of sheer, agonizing remorse. Elara, he said, his voice regaining its soft uncertainty. He walked toward me, his hands hovering, unsure if he had the right to touch me. I apologize for their ugliness. I understand now. That is who I was. That is the company I kept. That is the venom I allowed to live in this house. I shook my head, tears pricking my eyes. The battle was over. I was lost. That is who you were, I confirmed, stepping toward him, breaking the final rule of my self-imposed solitude. But you defended me, Rhys. The Earl defended his wife. He took the final, inevitable step, reaching out and gently touching my cheek, his thumb catching a single, slow-moving tear. I will always defend you, he vowed, his eyes filled with a terrifying, absolute certainty. I am sorry I didn't realize until now that you were the one who needed the most protection from me. The dam burst. My resolve, my fear, my dignity, it all washed away. The confrontation with his past had revealed the man he could be, and I could no longer deny the love I felt for this new reality. Part 6. The Choice. I found myself crying in the library. Not in my quiet sitting room, but amidst the vast, towering shelves of the library, a room Rhys had once used as a weapon, a silent testament to his superior intellect and my perceived inadequacy. I was standing near the fireplace, the book I'd been pretending to read long since forgotten on the fender. The tears were a release, not of pain, but of the intolerable pressure of weeks of conflicting emotion. The kindness, the defense, the dangerous dance. It had all led to this single devastating conclusion. I loved him. I loved the ghost, and I was going to risk everything for the brief, agonizing moment that he was real. He found me there. He didn't knock. He simply opened the heavy door, saw my shoulders shaking, and closed the door softly behind him. He walked toward me, his movements now entirely free of the invalid stiffness, his eyes full of the quiet determination I had come to both cherish and fear. He didn't speak. He simply stood before me, waiting until I raised my tear-streaked face to meet his gaze. Elara, he said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of the confusion of the amnesiac. It held the unwavering authority of the Earl, but colored with the tenderness of the man he had become. I don't care who I was. He reached out, his strong hands cupping my face, wiping away the tears with his thumbs. The gesture was possessive, demanding, and utterly devoted. I only care about who I am with you, he continued, his voice barely a breath. The man who wrote those foul words in the journal, the man who dismissed you, he is a stranger to me. But I know that when I look at you, I feel a connection so profound, so terrifyingly right, that it must be truth. He pulled me into his arms, the action sudden, irresistible, and absolute. My head rested against his shoulder, and I inhaled the clean, masculine scent of him, the scent of this new life, this stolen chance. Let me love you, Elara, he pleaded, his voice rough with emotion. For real this time. Let the man I am now give you the marriage he destroyed. And God help me, I believed him. The battle was over. The ghost had won. The risk of future ruin was nothing compared to the reality of the present. I wrapped my arms tightly around his waist and looked up at him, my choice made, my heart irrevocably given. Yes, I whispered, the word a confession, a surrender, a prayer. Yes, Rhys. He lowered his head, and I met him halfway. The kiss was everything the previous 4 years had denied us. It was not a duty, a transaction, or a cold formality. It was a choice. It was hungry and tender, full of the desperate longing of two people who had found each other across a chasm of time and tragedy. It was the moment of our true wedding, the affirmation of a love that should have been. We pulled away, breathless and trembling, our foreheads touching. The room was spinning slightly. For the first time, I saw no fear in his eyes, only a triumphant, pure adoration. My wife, he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of my jaw, my beautiful, brave wife. A wave of sweet relief washed over me. We were safe. The ghost was real. But as I watched the adoration in his eyes, a tiny, subtle shift occurred. The certainty wavered. The light of pure love was momentarily undercut by a flicker of concentration, a shadow of intense, uninvited thought. He lifted his head, turning his gaze away from me. He looked past me, toward the high, dark shelves of the library, specifically toward the heavy, brass-railed gallery that ran around the upper level of the room. His brow furrowed deeply. He wasn't looking at the books, he was looking at the space. "I remember this room," he whispered, his voice startlingly devoid of the recent warmth. It was flat, hollow as if speaking a rote phrase. My blood ran instantly cold. Every nerve ending in my body seized up. The glorious moment of love shattered, replaced by the crushing weight of existential dread. "What is it, Rhys?" I managed, my voice thin, terrified of the answer. He turned back to me, his hands still on my shoulders, but the connection was gone. His eyes, the gentle, kind gray eyes, were now wide, filled with a sudden, terrible recognition. I know the light in this room," he insisted, his voice rising, gaining a hard edge of memory. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the ghost of his former life. "I remember being up there." He pointed a trembling finger toward the gallery, watching Elara below, watching her try to find a book she liked, and thinking how utterly boring she was. He gasped, a horrified, choking sound, pulling his hands from me as if I had burned him. The memory, the cold, cruel assessment of the Earl, had invaded his new heart, a terrifying sliver of the past cutting through the present. He stumbled backward, knocking against the edge of the large reading table, his expression contorted with a mixture of confusion, revulsion, and dawning recognition. "I know that man," he whispered, staring at his hands, then at me. "I am that man." The ghost was vanishing. The monster was returning. I stood in the middle of the library, the promise of forever still warm on my lips, watching the man I loved dissolve before my eyes. The silence was deafening. Had he regained his memory completely? Had the kind man I nursed simply ceased to exist? I reached for him, my own voice a desperate plea. "Rhys, look at me! Who are you?" He looked up, meeting my eyes, and the finality of the tragedy hung suspended between us. The man looking back at me was a stranger, hovering on the terrifying precipice between the monster I hated and the ghost I loved. The moment stretched into an agonizing eternity, the answer, and the fate of my heart, suspended in his eyes. Part 7, The Unstable Man, The Ticking Clock. The space between us in the library, moments ago humming with shared passion, now felt like a desolate, frozen battlefield. Rhys stood beside the reading table, his hands open and trembling, staring at me as if I were a mirror reflecting the face of his greatest fear. "I know that man," he repeated, his voice barely audible, the raw horror of the realization clouding his eyes. I remember the coldness, the indifference, the way my stomach would clench with boredom whenever you spoke. He stumbled back another step. "I am sorry. I don't know why I kissed you. I don't know why I said I loved you. That man, the Earl, he is despicable. And if that memory belongs to me, then I am despicable too." It was a nightmare unfolding in terrifying, slow motion. The ghost was retreating, and the cruel stranger was peering out from behind his eyes. But what shocked me most was his revulsion. The cruel Earl had never felt disgust for himself. He only felt contempt for others. This Rhys, the unstable man hovering between two identities, hated his former self. I could not flee. I had made my choice, and I had tasted real love. I had to fight for the man who had asked me to dance, not the man who had called me a mouse. I closed the distance between us, stepping through the emotional rubble of the last few minutes. I reached out, placing my palms flat on his chest, feeling the frantic thunder of his heart beneath the fine cloth of his jacket. "Stop," I commanded, my voice firm and clear, borrowing the quiet authority I had witnessed when he defended me against his friends. "Stop claiming that man. He is a memory. You are real." He looked down at my hands on his chest, his breath hitching. "But how do you know, Elara? That feeling, that certainty that came with the memory. It was so strong. What if I wake up tomorrow and that cruel indifference is all that remains?" "It is not," I insisted, pushing a wave of my own terror aside. "That memory came with disgust, Rhys. The true Earl would not be sickened by his own arrogance. He would embrace it. You are terrified of becoming him. That fear is your proof." I forced him to look at me, framing his face with my hands. "Do you remember dancing with me in the parlor? Do you remember reading my old books? Do you remember defending me to your friends? Did that feel like a lie? No. he whispered, shaking his head. It felt like truth, the purest truth. Then that is the man you are, I concluded, pressing my forehead against his. The amnesia stripped away the bitterness, Rhys. It didn't invent a soul, it just freed the good one, and we must protect him. We stood there, clinging to each other, our moment of pure romance tragically undercut by the knowledge of a ticking clock. The memory was beginning to return, not in a flood, but in cruel, fragmented flashes that seemed to selectively revive the worst parts of the Earl. Over the following days, our relationship morphed into a desperate, heightened existence defined by this instability. Rhys was now a terrifying blend. He would ask me a gentle question about my favorite flower, only to have his face freeze mid-sentence, his eyes hardening with a detached clinical assessment of the room. He became intensely afraid of his own mind, checking the mirror for changes in his expression, afraid of the stranger that might look back. He began to search the house, drawn to objects that seemed to trigger a response. One afternoon, he found his old riding crop in a cabinet. He picked it up, and the leather felt suddenly familiar in his hand. He looked at me, his eyes wide and panicked. I used this on the hounds, didn't I? I was not gentle, was I? I shook my head, my throat tight. You were exacting, you demanded obedience. He hurled the crop across the room, the sharp crack against the wall echoing the break in his mind. I can't live like this, Elara. Half a monster, half a lie. I need to know which man I truly am. You are the man who threw that away, I replied, my voice unwavering. The new Rhys, however, was also driven by the terrifying authority of the Earl. He was protective, but now with a sharp, uncompromising edge. If a servant was careless, Rhys would deliver a cold, precise reprimand that left the person shaking. He would turn to me, his face pale, and ask, "Was that him? Was that the cruel Earl speaking?" I could only nod, watching the man I loved struggle against the very power I was supposed to have endured. He tried to retreat from me, afraid of what the returning memory would do to my heart. He slept in the dressing room one night, unable to bear the thought of waking up beside me as a stranger. I found him huddled there in the early morning light, his knees pulled to his chest. "I cannot risk hurting you again," he mumbled, his voice thick with guilt. "If he returns, I want you to be safe." I climbed onto the chaise beside him, pulling his head gently onto my shoulder. "You will not hurt me, Rhys," I said, my voice heavy with certainty. "Because if he returns, I will remind him of the man who saved me from his memory, and you are here now. We will fight him together." I held him, knowing that every moment of tenderness was a minute stolen from the past. The stakes were terrifyingly high. If the memory returned fully, would the love we had built be strong enough to anchor the good man, or would the Earl of Blackwood simply crush the fragile ghost he had become? Part 8. The Final Memory and the Anchor. The library scene had been a warning. The following weeks were a torment. Rhys was a man perpetually poised on a tightrope, desperately trying to keep his footing while the winds of his past tried to drag him into the abyss. Every piece of mail, every passing conversation, every familiar corner of the house was a potential trigger. The authority of the Earl was sharpening, his temper growing shorter, but always immediately followed by the crushed guilt of the amnesiac. He began to fear physical intimacy, terrified that in a moment of passion, the cold, transactional man of the past would take over. We slept in separate rooms, a choice he made out of love, but which felt like a crushing return to the desolate isolation of our marriage. The tension reached its breaking point on a rainy Tuesday. Rhys was in the study, sorting through his father's old correspondence, a task that required him to touch the lineage he couldn't fully remember. I was with him, ostensibly helping, but truly acting as a silent sentinel against the return of the monster. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from a lower shelf, a book of heraldry documenting the Blackwood family crest and history. As his fingers traced the intricate, familiar gold tooling, his body went rigid. He didn't make a sound, but the change was seismic. The subtle kindness in his jawline vanished. His eyes fixed on the crest hardened, losing their fear, losing their affection, and settling into the unmistakable, glittering disdain of the Earl of Blackwood. He looked up at me, and it was not Rhys. It was the cruel stranger, fully returned. "Elara," he said, his voice deep, resonant, and entirely without warmth. It was the voice that had commanded me 4 years ago. "What are you doing here?" Fetch the secretary. I have no time for the decorative silence of wives when there is actual work to be done. My breath seized in my throat. This was it. The ghost was gone. The full, crushing weight of the past had returned. I saw the indifference in his eyes, the casual cruelty of a man who viewed me as nothing more than a duty fulfilled and a persistent annoyance. He stood up, towering over me, every inch the cold, arrogant man who had left for the war. He moved to the desk, running a familiar hand over the polished surface, a look of proprietorship settling over his face. And why are the ledgers showing that ridiculous investment in tenant housing? Cancel it immediately. That kind of sentimental weakness is beneath this house. He picked up a pen, his movements sharp and decisive. And I see you've taken liberties with the master suite. Change the linens back to the stark white immediately. That floral pattern is utterly common. He glanced at me then, his eyes sweeping over me with a calculated assessment that cut deeper than any insult. You look tired, Elara. Try to manage your appearance better. It reflects poorly on the house. My heart did not shatter. It hardened, filling with the cold, protective resolve of the woman who had nursed the better man. I had promised the ghost I would fight for him. I would not allow this cold stranger to claim him without a battle. I walked slowly toward the desk, placing my hands flat on the wood, forcing him to look away from his ledgers and into my eyes. You are wrong, I stated, my voice low but firm, refusing to tremble. He looked annoyed, raising one eyebrow in the familiar, arrogant gesture of a man who never expected to be contradicted. I am sorry, wife. I'm afraid my memory is quite clear on my preferences and your place. No, I insisted. You remember the preferences of a brittle, unhappy man. You remember the cruelty he used as a defense, but you do not remember the man who was terrified of being him. He stared at me, the confusion flickering briefly behind the ice, the ghost refusing to be extinguished. Nonsense. I am the Earl of Blackwood. I am who I have always been. You are being sentimental and tiresome. I reached out and took his hand, the one gripping the pen so tightly. His flesh was cold, detached, but I held on. You are the man who begged forgiveness for that cruelty, I challenged, meeting his hard gaze. You are the man who was violently ill because of the wickedness he found in that journal. You are the man who stood in the parlor, humming a waltz, asking to learn to dance with the wife he had called a mouse. Do you remember calling me that? He flinched, a minute, almost imperceptible twitch of his lips. The memory was fighting back. I remember the truth, he countered, trying to pull his hand away, but I held fast. I remember the truth that you were a necessary burden. And I remember the truth that you told me you loved me, I whispered, the words a desperate, final throw of the dice. We kissed. Rhys, in the library. You looked at me with adoration, and you said you would always defend me. You said you would give me the marriage the Earl destroyed. You chose me. I was fighting for his soul, standing on the precipice of his memory. He looked torn, his gray eyes warring between the cold, cutting certainty of the Earl and the bewildered, heartbroken longing of the man who had pleaded for my love. Then, I did the only thing left. I raised his cold hand, placed it over my heart, and held it there. If you are the cruel Earl, I challenged, letting the love pour into my eyes, then look at me and tell me you feel nothing. Tell me our waltz was a lie. Tell me you want me gone, and I will leave this house forever. His breathing hitched, his focus fractured. He saw the fire beneath the ice. He saw the woman he had asked to teach him to dance. He saw the love he had begged to be allowed to give. The memory of the cold Earl was a powerful force, but the experience of the kind Rhys, the kindness, the vulnerability, the genuine love was a greater, more tangible truth. The indifference in his eyes trembled, then broke. The rigid set of his shoulders collapsed. The cold hand resting on my heart began to shake violently. No, he choked out, the sound ripped from the deepest part of his chest. His eyes glazed over, overwhelmed by the complete, terrifying integration of both memories. No, I remember. I remember the waltz. I remember the horror of that journal. I remember the pain I caused. I remember the man who left, and I remember the man I have been with you. The coldness was gone. The arrogance evaporated. What remained was the strength of the Earl, married to the deep, aching remorse of the amnesiac. He was neither one man nor the other. He was a new man, forged in the fire of both realities. He pulled me into a fierce, desperate embrace, clinging to me as if I were his only anchor in a suddenly churning sea of memory. Elara, he murmured into my hair, his voice thick with tears and a terrible, beautiful realization. My God, I have to live with the truth of what I was. I have to live with the knowledge of how I hurt you. But the man who left, he was wrong. The love, this. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes wet but clear. This is real. Welcome home, Rhys, I whispered, relief washing over me in a dizzying wave. The cruel stranger was vanquished. The man I loved had claimed his true identity. The memory was back, fully integrated. He knew his past, he knew his present, and he had chosen his future. The Earl of Blackwood was no longer a title of cold duty, but the name of the man who, given a second chance by fate, chose love over bitterness. The ending. Our marriage was no longer built on duty, but on a difficult, precious choice. Rhys now carried the heavy burden of his past self, the arrogance, the coldness, the pain he inflicted, every single memory. He had to face his staff, his tenants, and his friends, knowing the contemptible man he had been. But every morning, he woke up and consciously chose kindness. He chose to look at the woman he had wronged and spend the day earning her forgiveness. He never called me Elara without a certain reverence, and he never entered the parlor without a wistful look at the spot where we had danced. He didn't bring me wildflowers anymore. He brought me the ledgers, and together we reviewed the finances, making decisions based on compassion rather than cold profit. 1 year later, he stood with me in the library, looking up at the high gallery that had nearly destroyed us. I still remember looking down at you that day, he said, his voice quiet. I remember the awful, lonely emptiness I felt, despite all my pride. And now? I asked, lacing my fingers through his. He turned, his eyes holding the steadfast, loving devotion that was now his truth. Now, I only remember the woman who looked up and fought for my soul. You are my anchor, Elara. You are not my duty. You are my beginning. He leaned down and kissed me, a kiss that was both a solemn promise and a profound gratitude. The ghost was gone, replaced by a real, flawed, and loving man. And I, Elara, had finally received the kind of love that made the years of pain worthwhile. I was no longer the quiet wife. I was the true Countess of Blackwood, the woman who had saved the Earl from himself. And so the curtains close on the second chance of the Earl of Blackwood. Alara's fierce love didn't just win a second chance, it won a new man. Rhys now lives every day, not ignoring his past, but actively choosing to be better than the cold memory he carries. Their love story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the true self is the one you fight for and choose to become. What an incredible journey. Thank you for listening to every agonizing moment of Elara and Rhys's redemption. If this story touched your heart, please show your support. Give this video a like to let us know you want more emotional stories like this. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss our next saga. And most importantly, tell us what you thought. Comment below. Do you think Rhys could truly be forgiven for the cruelty of the man he once was? Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember that some loves are worth fighting for, even if that fight is against the past itself.